Welcome to the Blue Waters webinar. I'm Scott Lathrop with the Blue Waters Project at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dan Stanzione, Executive Director of the Texas Advanced Computing Center, Associate Vice President for Research at the University of Texas at Austin. Dan will be talking about the Service Provider Forum today. Thank you for joining us, Dan, and let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Scott, and good morning, everybody. So I am Dan Stanzione, and I am, as Scott mentioned, here at TAC, the Texas Advanced Computing Center, but I'm also a past chair of the Service Provider Forum. So on behalf of the forum, I wanted to say a few words about it to you. So what I'd like to do today is make this little slide advance. There we are. So is discuss the Service Provider Forum is really while technically independent, it's also sort of an integral part of XSEDE. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how XSEDE works. I think most people have heard of it. Not everybody knows exactly sort of how XSEDE operates. And then talk about the closely related things, the XSEDE Federation and the Service Provider Forum, and then hopefully explain why you should think that is interesting and what might be in it for you as we go through all this. So let me first begin by just giving you a little bit of context on XSEDE, and I put the vision and mission statement up there. And so XSEDE is often the place that people think of that they should go to for computing, which is true, but XSEDE is not actually the provider of the compute cycles themselves. XSEDE's more of a virtual organization that provides a set of services around the supercomputers and other cyber infrastructure devices, software frameworks, et cetera, that are funded by the NSF and occasionally by others. So XSEDE has this vision of building a set of tightly integrated digital services that allow the production of science. And XSEDE as an organization is to sort of bring everybody together around these resources and to help support them and add value to them as we move forward. So XSEDE really exists as sort of a connector of services, right? There is what we call the XSEDE infrastructure, but largely that is a marketplace of services provided by others, be them computers or storage systems or organizations that provide help, things like that. And then to sort of get the word out about those and to try and make the CI interoperable among CI for cyber infrastructure here, both across the US and around the world. So there's also, XSEDE is federated and has memos of understanding with providers in other countries, such as Open Science Grid and PRACE and Compute Canada, RIKEN in Japan, et cetera, and then to provide support to some of the larger NSF projects like LIGO or Cyberse or the Ocean Observing Institute, et cetera. So if you get right down to what is XSEDE, it's a virtual organization that provides what you might say in campus parlance are shared services. What are the things that everybody needs in order to provide an HPC or cyber infrastructure service? So it does not directly provide any computers or storage systems or networks. You're going through XSEDE to another provider to actually get those. But what XSEDE does do is link those services together and provide shared allocations, shared support, both frontline and in-depth code support, shared tickets, shared documentation, training services, education and outreach services, et cetera. So XSEDE provides a lot of services, but it doesn't actually provide the computers. So if XSEDE's not the one who provides the computers, then who actually does becomes the question. And that is, in fact, the service providers that make up the group of sort of affiliates of XSEDE. So what we're here to talk about today, along with XSEDE, is the Service Provider Forum. And the forum, as the name implies, is basically the place where the service providers get together. There's a group of those almost exclusively at universities and some sort of quasi-university organizations like NCAR that provide services, but it's where this group gets together to serve the open science community, primarily the university research community, to advise XSEDE and to help make things better, to exchange best practices, to advocate for things of common interest that all the service providers might want to do. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of those roles as we go through. But first, a little more on terminology. So there's a lot of relatively intricate things to sort out here. So in addition to the service provider forum, you have to understand the concept of the XSEDE Federation. So XSEDE, as I mentioned, is a virtual organization. It's a single large NSF award to actually, I think, 14 institutions have part of the XSEDE award. The XSEDE Federation is the group of organizations that have some formal affiliation with XSEDE. So that is actually a long list of folks. So that includes service providers, all the folks you might think of, us here at TAC, the Pittsburgh Supercomputer Center, the San Diego Supercomputer Center, NCSA, Indiana, Purdue, and so on and so forth, are all service providers. There are those other organizations that collaborate with XSEDE are also part of the Federation. Anybody who has a formal MOU, so PRACE, which is the European equivalent, providing the shared computing infrastructure for Europe, Compute Canada, I mentioned RIKEN, those things. And then there are some other service providers that don't provide necessarily computers. There are things like the Science Gateways Community Institute, which provides a set of both software and human services if you're building a website for a particular domain-specific community, what we call a science gateway. So they also allocate some services through XSEDE. The National Center for Genome Analysis Studies has sort of genome-based, genomics-based web services that you can come to and get through XSEDE. So we have hardware providers, we have software providers. In theory, we could have, groups that say just provide training as a service provider. So service provider is really a broad term that is not necessarily just computing. In fact, back in the TeraGrid days before XSEDE, we referred to them as resource providers, but we've really gotten, sort of evolved to this notion of digital services, that it can be any kind of service can make you a provider. So we have providers, and then we have sort of non-providers that make up the Federation. And then we have the Federation versus the Forum, and that's such a clear thing, the Federation versus the Forum, that we've had to produce Venn diagrams to actually explain what is the relationship between the Forum and the Federation. So if it seems confusing, that's because as far as I can tell, it actually is confusing. But I'm going to try and do my best job, do the best I can to give you a clear explanation of this. So if you are a service provider and you are part of the XSEDE Federation, you are in the Forum. However, there are Federation members that are not service providers and therefore are not in the Forum. And it is also possible, although I believe at the present time this is a theoretical construct, for you to be a service provider and join the Forum and not join the XSEDE Federation. Like I said, I don't think there's an extant example of that at the moment. So there are people who provide digital services, which is sort of our right-hand circle in our Venn diagram here. There are people who are Federation partners and part of the Federation with XSEDE, and there is a large degree of overlap between those that actually form the Forum, well, in that intersection of XSEDE Federation and Service Provider Forum. So although the Service Provider Forum is technically independent of XSEDE, there is a lot of interface with XSEDE, as you might imagine. But there's also a few of those Federation members, like the PRACE and RIKENs and Compute Canadas of the world, that are part of the Federation but are not part of the Forum. So you tend to apply and join them together. In 90% of the cases, there's overlap, but there's a few outliers where they're not exactly the same thing. So within the Forum itself, there's also different kinds of service providers. And see, I still use the old term resource provider in the slide title. It's only been 7 years. I'll figure it out soon. So, but we have 3 kinds of service providers that are just called level 1, 2, and 3 because we're not particularly creative. But a level 1 service provider is what you traditionally think of when you think of a TeraGrid or XSEDE resource provider. So this is someone who is funded typically by NSF to provide a fully integrated service that's offered through XSEDE. So you think of the big machines that are currently part of XSEDE, Stampede 2, Bridges, Comet, Wrangler, Jetstream. So they were NSF funded through a program that funds XSEDE resources or XSEDE services. They have an NSF mandate to be a part of XSEDE. So they both provide a service that XSEDE allocates. In all those cases, most of the resource is allocated to the national community through XSEDE, and they have full integration. There's a long checklist of services that they provide with XSEDE, and you have to check off all the boxes to be a level 1 service provider. Level 2 is a bit of a hybrid. So you provide one or more digital services that at least are partially available through XSEDE to the national community. So the idea is you have some resource and you want to get users probably outside your institution on it. You know, you've had a project where you said, we promise to recruit a broad case of users or a broad swath of users to use on our machine. And we want to use XSEDE to get to those users. And you have at least some integration, but you don't have to do all the things that a level 1 service provider has to do. So the canonical examples of those are people who get, say, MRI funding with a specialized resource that they promise to make, say, 25% of available to the national community. So the Extreme GPU machine at Stanford is one example of that. The SuperMIC machine at LSU is an example of that. So there are a few of those kinds of things. There are other ones that provide non-traditional services that also want to provide to sort of reach a national community and use XSEDE to get there. So the Science Gateways Community Institute that I already mentioned is one of those. The Cyber GIS service that provides geospatial services at the University of Illinois is another one that is a level 2 provider because they have some resources that they want to provide to the community. They technically have their own funding stream and they're independent of XSEDE to do that, but they want to use some of XSEDE's resources to reach a larger community or to, and you know, perhaps seed allocation of some of that to XSEDE. So that's level 2. And then there's level 3, which is sort of the loosest coupling. It's just sort of an affiliation in this case, and it's the bulk of the members actually. And so if you're a level 3 service provider, you agree to, you know, perhaps, again, the canonical case is you're running the research computing services for your campus. You know, you have your local compute cluster, your local storage facilities. You want to use XSEDE to let people know that you exist and it's out there and that your users can request it. So you agree to basically register it in the XSEDE database of services. So you advertise at least one digital service through XSEDE that is a resource you have. You may or may not choose to make your resources available through XSEDE interfaces, like say the single sign-on hub or through the XSEDE user portal, but you don't have to do that. You don't necessarily need to do anything to make your services locally available through XSEDE. So you can still preserve any way that you also have to make your services available, direct login, whatever it happens to be. None of these services, because they tend to not be funded through NSF, are required to put any XSEDE allocated users through there. But you know, if you have a user on your campus who's browsing through XSEDE and they say, hey, here's my local group that I can go to, it might be a way to help you reach your user base. So we do see increasingly, initially it was just sort of, you know, register your service with XSEDE and get advertised. As the project has evolved, we see more actual adoption of XSEDE services that level 3s can use. And this is actually a fairly frequent discussion topic at the forum. But so, for instance, we've been adapting the single sign-on hub, which is at this point a virtual machine that's hosted, I believe, at Indiana, that keeps SSH keys and trust. So you get an account on the single sign-on hub through an XSEDE account, and then from there you can jump to any resource in the federated resource space. This actually started at a smaller university that, of course, like every university, and every project that all of you work on, you have partners outside your institution, right? So, and you want to work in the same space. So even if you're using your local machine, you have your collaborator at another university they need to get on. If you're using your university's account space, I think there's a committee where they discuss how to make it as complicated as possible to request an account at another university if you're not an employee or a student there. So we've extended the single sign-on hub so that you can enroll your campus resource in it and control the users that come in. And then people can just go get XSEDE accounts and use the XSEDE account to hit I think West Virginia and Colorado were the two universities that were starting with this, right? So if you're collaborating with someone at West Virginia, you need to get into the West Virginia storage system or the West Virginia cluster. You can get an XSEDE account, come through the single sign-on hub. Another one that Dave Hart, who runs allocations for XSEDE, has been pushing is extending the allocation system, right? If you're getting dozens of proposals from people and you need to, have them make requests and then sort them and review them and do all the things that you have to do an allocations process, that can be pretty complicated. It's something XSEDE has built out through the XSEDE Resource Allocation Service, or XRAS. So you may just want to use XRAS for your campus. The fleet of aircraft at NCAR that they schedule for research services is now an XRAS adopter. So if you want to make a request to schedule time on an airplane to do a flyover and take images, you use the XSEDE allocation system, the same thing we've done to hand out compute time for many years. So as a level 3, you can join the Federation and have access to some of these services that XSEDE provides that might be useful, again, if you're running a compute resource or if you're running any other sort of digital resource. Hopefully there are some things there for you. So we have the forum and the Federation, and then within the forum we have our level 1, level 2, and level 3 providers. So we get all these folks together fairly regularly through the forum. Well, before I get into that, 2 more slides. So these are just some charts that I stole from some XSEDE documentation that sort of lists what, as a service provider who joins the Federation, you can expect from XSEDE at level 1, level 2, and level 3. And the next slide is the other way around, what XSEDE would expect from you if you were to join. So you can sort of see things fall off as we get, level 1s do everything and then it falls off. So the first line is we can publish information about your resources and share them with the community. And that's true of every level, right? You can provide opportunities to participate in trainings and workshops and the annual conference and things like that. All the members get those benefits at level 1, 2, or 3. We'll monitor your service and set off an alarm 24 hours a day if it goes down for you. That's true at level 1 or level 2. If you have an allocated resource, we'll monitor it for you. So that's something you don't get at level 3, and then so on and so forth. You can see the various things there. The XSEDEnet is actually deprecated. That's just a virtual overlay on Internet 2 now. So we used to have, you would bring in a dedicated fiber. You don't need to do that anymore at level 1 or level 2. You just join as long as you're on Internet 2, you can join the service. But you see there are things about, do you have access to the ticket system? Will we provide direct user support? Things to people on your resource is true only at level 1, for instance. So you can sort of see the differences between level 1, 2, and 3 in services there. Likewise, there are expectations that go the other way. And again, if you're a level 3, it's sort of the lightest touch. The only thing you actually have to do is give us information about the resource that XSEDE wants to share is the only requirement, but there's some things you can do if you would like to. And again, there's a long list of things you have to do if you're a level 1. If you're a level 2, there's enough you have to do so that we can share them through XRAC, which is the XSEDE Resource Allocation Committee. And then again, at a level 3, all you have to do is advertise the service, but you can do some other things. But that's the only expectation that XSEDE will have of you. So a bit about the membership. At the moment, if you actually go and look at the membership list, it's much longer, but every service that you provide technically is a member on its own. So like here at TAC, we're members 5 times, and I don't count that. So there's really 5 institutions that are providing level 1 services at the moment: the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center, the San Diego Supercomputing Center, TAC here in Texas, Indiana, and Open Science Grid. We have 6 institutions that provide level 2 services, so some integration with XSEDE. I mentioned LSU Supermix, Stanford Extreme. There's a machine at Purdue. NCAR has some services. The Gateways Institute. Blue Waters is actually a level 2 member and participates in the forum through that membership. So that's one of the ways NCSA joins. And then there's 20 institutions, 20 distinct institutions. Some of them have more than one service. Rutgers, for instance, has 3. But 20 L3 members. So there's 31 institutions that get together and discuss things at the forum right now. So you get a pretty nice swath of those who are providing cyber infrastructure services around the community. to get together. So that's sort of theory of operation for all this. So none of that probably tells you what actually happens at a forum meeting if you come to one. So what does the forum really do? So we meet every 2 weeks in a webinar, or via phone call, something like this. We're actually using Zoom at the moment. So we also meet in person at major conferences that most of these folks would show up anyway. The PEARC conference. PEARC is what used to be called the XSEDE conference. This is the second year of it being PEARC. This July in Pittsburgh. Get your papers in now. So I think there'll be a future webinar on PEARC, but it's a great meeting. It's a little better for one-on-one interactions than supercomputing is, which is the other place we meet. But supercomputing draws about 12,000 people, so it's a giant vendor fest and trade show. And PEARC draws 700 people who are sort of the staff providing resources and users, and it's a lot smaller opportunity to get together with just 600 or 700 folks. You actually can just about talk to everybody during the course of the week. So highly recommend PEARC as just a side plug there. But really within the forum meeting, there's sort of two, we have agendas and things we discuss every week, but they really fall into two categories that I'll dive down in. One is advise XSEDE on the XSEDE Service Provider Interface, right? All those things that were in that expectations chart. What works, what doesn't, what should XSEDE do, how should it change how it spends its money and its plans. And then there's all the stuff that we as the 31 institutions providing resources care about and need help with that is not related to XSEDE that we want to talk about. So that's sort of the other function of the forum. So in the XSEDE Service Provider Interface, sort of the first topic, and this, almost every meeting there's a discussion of something related to XSEDE, but we provide feedback, advice, complaints, questions, all sorts of things that really fall into sort of two categories. One is the formal feedback we provide. So we have a formal process whereby XSEDE gives us the annual project plans before they're approved by NSF. We write memos to talk about, things we would like to see changed as service providers. So if you really want to have a chance to weigh in on how XSEDE resources are spent, this is a place to do it. We occasionally get questions from NSF program staff, or we get requests from XSEDE leadership to weigh in on some issue, usually prior to an annual report or a site visit. So we'll put out some formal policy statement memos of, the recommendations of the Service Provider Forum to NSF or XSEDE. We fairly frequently write, gather feedback about a particular topic that we've been asked about and just send it to the XSEDE PI or XSEDE leadership to discuss. So we'll send a formal memo right now to John Towns, who's the overall PI, and say, John, we discussed with your managers in this area, about changes to the allocations process. Here's what we think ought to happen. Do with this what you will, but we'll do some formal things. So, just recently, we just finished the project year 8, so starting in June, the next year of XSEDE's plans. We're currently reviewing the reviewer's manual, which is, guidance to reviewers who actually make decisions about who gets what resources. We've been trying to formalize and update some of the policies there. A recent discussion was on that registry of services, on how we index resource providers or service providers and share that with the community. And we wanted to make sure we were getting the right information out there so people could find the services that they need, and XSEDE was doing the best job of sort of advertising our services. So that was a discussion about a month ago, and changing that. And then we also have a lot of informal feedback roles. We get fairly regular briefings. Victor Hazelwood is the service provider coordinator within XSEDE. Victor's at Tennessee. I have his email address in here later. So he briefs at pretty much every meeting on what's going on in operations and what he needs from service providers or what they need from him. But we also talk to the training coordinator, the allocations manager, to the people who run extended support services fairly regularly, and just discuss with them, what questions do they have, what questions do we have from them, what we think we ought to be doing. So again, I think there is a significant chance to impact XSEDE operations through these, and the whole notion of, hey, let's take what we do in the single sign-on hub and extend that space to non-level 1 and level 2 providers is a recommendation that started in the forum that became a funded XSEDE project to do something about, so that service is now available to any campus that wants it. So there, you really can make changes in what XSEDE does as part of the forum. So, but again, we also have a fairly significant role. This may probably hit the point where this is more than 50% of the forum time, is on things that don't relate to XSEDE at all, but are things that those of us who are in the digital services business for university researchers want to get advice on, to compare notes on, to delve into what are we going to do about this. So we have pretty wide-ranging discussions on a broad list of technical topics. So one that has come up several times in the last year or two has been in various different forms. The latest acronym is Controlled Unclassified Information. 3 years ago, that was, what are we doing about HIPAA data? And then it became, what are we doing about HIPAA and FSMA data? And then, what are we doing about HIPAA, FSMA, and ITAR data? And now in NIST 800-171, it is, how do you put in the appropriate controls to deal with controlled unclassified information? And I think everyone who's doing a lot of computing for anyone at this point, particularly as we start to touch more medical and health, but also more social sciences, you have student data, you have personal information, you have personal health information. Frankly, if you're doing deep space probes and you have orbiting, one instance we ran into is if you're doing orbits around Mars and trying to insert a probe for NASA around Mars, anything that does orbital insertion is classified by missile defense as a protected weapons code. So you have to have all sorts of controls in place around your systems to do this. And in fact, we're starting to see them on, any dollar that comes from NIH and across all sorts of agencies. So this is a topic that we're all struggling with, how we're going to handle, how much we're going to do. Do we just say no? Do we put extra charges on for services? Do we just figure it out? So these are things that, it helps to not figure out in a vacuum and to be able to talk to your colleagues about. So it's really, I think, a crucial function of the forum. Most of us use Globus to move data in and out. There's been changes to what's open source and what's licensed. We've had talks about what's the impact of that? Is this really a big deal from us? For the things we have to change, what are we going to change? Can we do this at the same time in a uniform way? Do we need to talk to the Globus project, et cetera, et cetera? Containers has been a big one, right? Again, 2 years ago, we had discussion about virtual machines. This past year, that turns into discussion about Docker containers and Singularity and things like that. So what is the role for containers in scientific computing? Jupyter Notebooks has been one recently, too, that we've talked about. So there's a whole bunch of technical discussions that we have that's just, hey, how are we going to solve these problems? Can you share with me how you're solving these problems? And that kind of discussion. We've also occasionally written policy statements together. So, NSF periodically puts out requests for comments. Manish Parashar sent out something this morning from the Office of Cyber Infrastructure, looking for inputs on future plans. But, last year, I believe, maybe a year and a half ago now, NSF put out a call for, help us get input on the vision for cyber infrastructure in 2030. And we wrote a formal response to that as a group. So occasionally as a group, we'll get together and say, look, we represent 30 universities that do this stuff and do it pretty well at scale. This is our collective opinion about these things, and hopefully that weights a little more than just one of us complaining about a topic or trying to put input in. So those are sort of the two big functions of the Service Provider Forum. I did mention that one of those functions is, well, let me just say something about membership first, and then I want to come back and talk a little bit more about XSEDE. And the things you can sort of influence within XSEDE. But hopefully there might be one or two of you who are not currently members who might be interested. So can your campus join? And the answer is almost invariably yes. There's a way in. My guess is if you were going to be a level 1 or a level 2 service provider, you probably would know that by now, because you probably have something in your cooperative agreement with NSF that suggests or compels you to do such a thing. Although it is possible if you have some project where you're trying to build community and you think XSEDE may be able to help you get usage, that you might want to join as an L2. But for an L3, almost anybody operating any digital service, website, cluster, downloadable software package, whatever it is, you can become an L3 service provider. And again, the only thing you have to commit to is to use XSEDE as a venue to advertise the service that you're providing to the community. So You do not need to open it up to XSEDE users. You can open it up to XSEDE users, but it's not a requirement. So if you go to the XSEDE website, the XSEDE Federation, you basically just send a letter that explains the service that you want to put in and why you would like to join. There's a template for the letter with all the required sections at the XSEDE website, and you send that to the chair of the forum, who's currently Sean Strandy at San Diego Supercomputing Center, and to John Towns as the PI for XSEDE at Illinois in CSA. And so you just fill out that template and you can join. So I would encourage everybody, if you're providing some service, to go ahead and sign up and become a part of the forum. They're really, for the most part, very valuable calls. To some extent, they are calls. You have to join another call, but we have really good discussions very frequently on there. So, you know, now that we've sort of talked about the forum, many of these service providers are providers within XSEDE. And I think a lot of people don't really understand this sort of separation and interface, that when you talk about, you know, running on ComEd at San Diego, that is accessible through XSEDE, but is actually two separate entities that you're dealing with. So just a little bit about sort of what this group has accomplished in XSEDE. And I'd like to credit / apologize to John Towns for the slides of his that I found and stole when preparing this talk. But this is about a year-old summary, but a summary of the first 5 years, five and a half years of XSEDE and what has been supported. These are always hard metrics, and you know, assume they're error bars and all of these numbers, because it's hard to collect these from users. But we do try and get users asking for allocations to report on what grants do you have that that are in support of this allocation, and where do they come from, and how many dollars are they. So about $3 billion in research has been supported through all XSEDE projects and all of the XSEDE projects that come through to the service providers through those years. Something that a lot of people find surprising is only about a third of that is NSF support. You know, we are open to anyone doing open and unclassified research in the United States and foreign partners of U.S. researchers. You know, all of them can apply for time on the XSEDE allocated resources. So about a third of it ends up being NSF, about a fifth of it ends up being NIH, another fifth DOE, but then there's a whole set of unclassified grants from Defense, from NASA, and various others that show up as well. So there's a wide range of resource, and a lot of it. There is a lot of people who get supported. So again, this just shows, I believe this is the current snapshot of all the groups that form partnerships within XSEDE. We have the 5 centers that sort of form the core partners in CSA, PSC, TAC, NICS, and SDSC. But then we have various specialized services from all sorts of places that provide bits and pieces of this sort of service federation of things that we need. Shodor Foundation, Purdue, Indiana, Chicago, Ohio, Sura, just a wide range of folks. So this is actually the XSEDE team, and these are actually funded within the XSEDE grant. The service provider grants are again separate. And I think one thing we have seen as we support all these people moving forward, and this is a quote I really like. In fact, we can add the LIGO one, but you know, we've all, and I suspect everybody on this call believes this, right? That computation has become, you know, well, really in the last 35 or 40 years, a truly integral part of the scientific discovery process. In the last 10 or 15 years, computation and data and the ability to digitally manipulate digital data has become even more intrinsic to the scientific process. And the sort of long tail of that is we're starting to see computational science feature prominently in things like Nobel Prizes. So this is a quote from a computational structural biologist about XSEDE, who is a Nobel laureate and who won one of the first Nobel Prizes around that was driven by high performance computing. You look at the LIGO Nobel Prize last year, also computing really at the core of what they do. They partnered with XSEDE and use Stampede and Open Science Grid and various other machines that are provided through XSEDE, through the service providers, to make that discovery. So we've gone from being able to just say, look, we support a whole lot of people and a whole lot of grants, which we do, as of this slide, to also saying, look, at the very largest scale, the most important scientific discoveries that are being made in the world are increasingly the result of computation. So hopefully somewhere in these 15,000 researchers and students that are currently using XSEDE, we have some of our future Nobel Prize winners in there. That is an awful long tail to get to. You usually don't get to support a student and then write the next year in your annual report that they won the Nobel Prize. But I think we see that pipeline forming as, towards many more computationally oriented Nobel Prizes coming. And again, these are sort of researchers and students is just information captured on the portal. So those are probably pretty solid numbers. Publications are self-reported, so it could be over-reported or under-reported depending on how many publications people want to put in when they ask for more time and allocations. But we can track 15,000 students, faculty members, postdocs, 21,000 publications. We get about 900 proposals a year for time on or allocation of these various services. They get reviewed by the committee that does allocations. So that's a major function, is just reviewing, ranking, and getting those proposals. So those are the large scale ones that go to the committee. We have an equal number of startup allocations, educations for classrooms. I know just on Stampede, we did something on the order of 500 startups last year. So there are, multiple thousands of requests for services. The user requests is more tickets, answering questions, giving help. So 77,000 requests from users that have been responded to by XSEDE. And then I'll say a little bit more about this at the very end, but we launch a number of projects that provide direct support, what we call our extended collaboration and support. And so we've had more than 375 projects where XSEDE staff have worked with a computational scientist to best use these resources that are allocated through XSEDE. And so, almost 400 instances of that. And it wouldn't be a good talk about XSEDE if I didn't mention that, by the way, you can get these resources yourself. So again, they're allocated through a peer review process. It's open to any US open science researcher. So again, we don't do classified research on the machines for DoD. You need to get a different resource for that. There must be a US partner in every project, but you don't have to be all US persons, or you don't have to actually reside in the US. We have a number of users in other countries, really all around the world. But you must, if you are partnered with someone in the US, they can add researchers from other universities. So it's open to almost every country. There are a couple of restrictions for what Department of Commerce calls Tier 3 countries. So I believe there are 5 countries that we can't support, but the other 200 plus are more than welcome. And it is independent of funding source. As I mentioned and showed in that pie chart, you do not need to have NSF support in order to become a user of XSEDE or any of the resources allocated through XSEDE. And then also true, they're not free because somebody pays for them, but to you as the end user, XSEDE resources are provided at no cost. So NSF invests about $100 million a year, not all to XSEDE, but between XSEDE and all the various resource providers and the services, the systems, the operations around all of those. The total investment's about $100 million a year. So all of that is available without you having to pay a dime. You just have to write the proposal. So if you would like to do this, go to the XSEDE user portal, portal.xsede.org. If you've never done it before, again, you can get your own allocation. If you know someone who has an allocation, they can put you on their allocation if you're working with them on a project. But what you want to do is just go to the portal. If you're a first-time investigator, don't worry about all the complicated stuff yet. Just click Startup Allocation and fill out the form. It's a fairly lightweight thing to do. And then just a last note, one that I think is one of the most valuable services in XSEDE, and I'm not trying to do the comprehensive list of services. There's so many things that are available through XSEDE. You can browse the website and see them. But this one I think is one that more people could use than do, and is one of the distinguishing features, is the Extended Collaborative Support Service. So this is where it's probably the largest single budget item in XSEDE, but there are 35 to 40 funded, 35 to 40 lines. It spans about 100 people who are computational experts in performance, in web portals, in particular scientific libraries, whose job it is to make sure that you can use the resources well. So if you need your code to scale, if you need to figure out how to get your gateway to integrate with the big systems, you can get allocated not just time on the systems or storage space, but you can get allocated 6 months of somebody's time to come work on your project and help you out to do this. And again, this is where we see the sort of most gratifying to me, because we really are deeply involved in them, but the most gratifying and the most impactful sort of collaborations with XSEDE is through this service. So again, you request an allocation through a proposal just like you would for compute time, or attached to your proposal for compute time. Address to get more help there, but again, you can port application to a new resource, you can do better algorithms, you can use new libraries. I/O is a big one. We're constantly working with I/O, but you can ask for visualization help, automating workflows. There's all sorts of great stuff there. So with that, let me just say there's lots of places you can go to get help. If you'd like to know more about XSEDE or the forum or anyone else, so you can submit tickets through the portal. You can email help@XSEDE. You can call the help desk at the phone number there. These slides will all be posted in part of the recording, so you have all that information. You can go and get training from the portal for sort of, how to pick a resource, how to get started. There's a calendar of courses, there's online training. And particularly if you have questions about being a service provider, feel free to reach out to me. But Victor Hazelwood is the XSEDE staff member who is the service provider coordinator, and victor@utk.edu is his email there. So please reach out to Victor if you need to. And so we'll save a few minutes for questions here, and I will just stop right there. So thanks very much for your time and attention, and I'm happy to stick around for a little while and answer any questions that might come up.
Thank you very much, Dan. If you have questions, you can feel free to post them on the YouTube live chat or in the Slack channel if you're connected to either of those. One question did come up, which I could read the answer or just ask you, Dan. Someone asked, where do they find information about the forum on the website? Looks to me like it's under XSEDE.org, under governance.
Yep. Yeah, there's a federation tab. And so because of this federation forum confusion, we never know what to make the top level tab in the website. It's been a debate that's taken an embarrassing number of hours over the years. But yes, if you go to the XSEDE website, and then yes, I believe it's under governance, and look for the federation, you can find all the information about the forum, about how to join, etc.
Okay. And then there was a question, I think you've covered it fairly well, but what are you looking for in the letter of application to participate in the forum? And
yeah, so there's
highlights?
Usually the letter ends up being a page and a half. It's not, a 5-page, 10-page proposal document you have to write, but you need to, so you will find with that the sort of charter and what we ask. Essentially you need to articulate why you would like to join. So we ask you to sort of explain what the services are that you would advertise through XSEDE. So you might say, hey, we are producing this piece of software for the molecular dynamics community to use, and we'd like it to be more widely known. We're happy to share it out through XSEDE. You might say we operate the research computing resources for our campus, and we operate a compute cluster for our local users, and we'd like them to be able to find it through XSEDE. But you say, in essence, what are the services that you'd like to advertise? Why do you want to join? And what do you expect to get out of XSEDE? And again, usually these are like a page and a half to get through all the sections. Contact information, right? Who can we reach? Things like that. But yeah, you can find the template. It's a step-by-step, fairly easy process to go through. And Victor would be happy to walk you through it. So.
And the question is, there's no out-of-pocket cost to join, correct?
That is correct. Yep. So the idea is, like anything else, it costs a little bit of your time, and that is the most valuable commodity we have. But the assumption is, the resources are being funded through NSF or through your campus or wherever. XSEDE is funded through NSF. We're not trying to generate any more money about this. We're just trying to, fulfill XSEDE's mission to sort of unite these services across the country. So, yep, no out-of-pocket expenses other than, there's also really no additional budget for it. So if you want to come to the in-person meeting at PEARC, the forum can't pay for that. So, you're out of your own pocket due to travel and things like that. But no, there's no membership fee.
Okay, I don't believe there are any more questions. So with that, I'll ask everyone to join me in thanking Dan for a terrific update on the Service Provider Forum. Thank you very much, Dan. Those of you that have registered for this webinar will receive a link to the final recording of the session, so you can watch it in the future or share it with others. And we always look forward to your feedback on what we can do to make the webinar more interesting, more useful, and other topics you might want to see covered. With that, we thank you and hope to see you at a future webinar.